This is the story about how Gordon Griltz survived his first prison riot. In September 1984, he arrived at the Central Unit, a high-security facility in Florence, Arizona, often referred to as the Walls. Just 2 weeks into his stay, he got caught in a riot. It was a Saturday, and a significant tackle football match was scheduled on the sports field. The teams consisted of white inmates facing black inmates, with the Mexican inmates acting as referees. Considerable amounts of drugs and money were bet on the game's outcome, making it a very serious event. He attended the game with a group of white friends. His primary interest wasn't the game, but rather working out at the weightlifting area. The Aryan Brotherhood had claimed a picnic table beside the field, displaying a large rebel flag. He mentioned to his friends that he intended to hit the weights, but they advised him to stick with them. Going solo in that situation wasn't wise, they warned. Heeding their advice, he stayed with the group. As the game progressed, the referees seemed to make decisions that favored the black team excessively. Later, they discovered that the Mexican referees had been bribed to influence the results. John, who alongside his brother Paul led the Aryan Brotherhood, they confronted one of the referees over a questionable call, hitting him in the face and knocking him down, and that was the action that sparked the riot. The scene quickly turned chaotic, with inmates from all racial groups, including whites, blacks, Mexicans, and Native Americans, engaged in the fight. The battle lines fluctuated, and being knocked down presented the risk of being severely beaten or even killed. Many inmates from each group fell victim to trampling and stomping in the chaos. After a short while, the Native Americans distanced themselves from the confrontation, retreating to a far side of the field since it was not their fight. The black inmates followed suit, leaving the conflict predominantly between the whites, led by the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Mexicans, commanded by the Mexican Mafia. They later learned that some prison guards had contacted the Florence Police Department and the Arizona Highway Patrol via radio, inviting them to witness the violence unfolding on the field. The whites charged towards the weight area, forcing the Mexicans back towards the rec shack and the fence separating the Central Unit's field from the Special Programs Unit in the South Unit. It was then that they found Brian, a white inmate transferred from out east, lying injured behind the weight equipment. He'd been the only white person on the weight pile when the riot erupted. The Mexicans had stabbed him in the back and struck his head with a weight, fracturing his skull. Gordon found him twitching on the ground, with brain matter seeping from his shattered skull, and one eye rolled back. Despite his state, the Mexicans continued hurling weights at him, trying to finish him off. Meanwhile, Mexicans from the South Unit were tossing weapons, including tools, over the fence to aid their peers along the fence. The situation had developed into a deadlock, with both sides resorting to throwing whatever they could grab at each other. John, another inmate, joined Gordon, and they stayed with Brian, shielding him from the objects being thrown. Unfortunately, that was all they could do for him. Eventually, guards stationed in 2 towers fired warning shots from their shotguns. Meanwhile, the guards working in the recreational area secured themselves inside the rec shack, waiting out the riot unharmed. John and Gordon realized they needed to get Brian out of there if he was to have any chance of survival. They lifted him by his arms and legs and headed for the Sallyport gate. In doing so, they had to pass through a group of Mexicans pressed against fences on both sides, risking their own lives in the process. Upon reaching the Mexican front lines, they paused. The younger individuals looked to their leaders for directions. They saw the leaders gesture, granting them passage, allowing them to be the first to leave the field. They laid Brian down at the rotunda, and the guards instructed them to return to their cell blocks and lock themselves in. The riot concluded, and other injured inmates were slowly escorted out. Sadly, Brian didn't make it. He succumbed to his head injury en route to the hospital. Gordon got through his first prison riot without losing his life. His attempt to save someone earned the respect of both groups involved. The following day, as the prison remained on lockdown, he had two visitors. The first was the porter, overseen by the white inmates, who came around gathering items for those in lockup. Gordon handed him a bar of soap and a pack of Camels. The porter inquired if he intended to go back to the field once the yard reopened. He confirmed his plan to return to the wait area. Gordon's second visitor was the chaplain. They knelt on opposite sides of the cell door, speaking through the hole. The chaplain asked if Gordon was all right. Gordon recounted the incident, and they prayed for Brian and all the wounded, thanking God for watching over him and protecting him during the riot.
The New Mexico State Penitentiary riot started on February 2, 1980, at the Penitentiary of New Mexico near Santa Fe. It is considered the most violent prison riot in U.S. history. During the riot, inmates seized complete control of the facility, taking 12 officers hostage. Inmate-on-inmate violence resulted in the unaliving of 33 prisoners, with many being tortured and mutilated for being informants. The prison was reclaimed by police 36 hours later. Although none of the hostages were unalived, 7 officers were seriously injured, suffering from beatings and grapes. The riot at the Penitentiary of New Mexico was driven by severe overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, inadequate separation of violent and nonviolent inmates, and poor quality food. The snitch system fostered distrust among inmates, leading to increased violence. Despite multiple investigations and the Duran Consent Decree calling for reforms, changes were resisted, setting the stage for the riot. Conflicting reports of inmate populations revealed overcrowding beyond the facility's capacity at the time of the riot. The riot began with intoxicated inmates who had made homemade liquor. Inmate Gary Nelson overheard a plan to attack the guards during the 1 a.m. count if the dorm door wasn't locked. During this routine check, 2 officers entered the dormitory, while a third stayed outside to lock the door, but the door was left unlatched. At 1:40 a.m., on February 2, 1980, inmates overpowered the officer at the door, taking 4 officers hostage. The prisoners overwhelmed other officers at the south end of the prison. The riot might have been contained if the grill to the south wing had been closed. Officers Larry Mendoza and Antonio Vigil, who were having breakfast, noticed a prisoner in an officer's uniform near the open grill and quickly warned the control center. The inmates gained full control of the prison by 2:05 a.m. by breaking the supposedly bulletproof glass of the control center with a fire extinguisher. This granted them access to lock and door controls. In a shocking series of events, 2 gangs within the prison incited extreme violence and chaos. The Chicanos, one of the gangs, aimed to protect their own and execute retribution against specific enemies. The other gang, referred to as the Aryan Brotherhood, was composed of dangerous inmates who had been moved from segregation. Their main objective was to enter Cell Block 4, which held 96 prisoners classified as informers, mentally ill, sex offenders, or otherwise vulnerable individuals. After seizing the control center, the gang sought revenge against these inmates, but first looted drugs from the psychology wing. The drugs were distributed among inmates, and a fire was set to destroy records used to deny parole. Unable to initially breach Cell Block 4 due to locked doors, the rioters utilized blowtorches from nearby Cell Block 5 to cut through the grills over several hours. Meanwhile, they raided the records office for files identifying informers and broadcasted their violent intentions over the radio to prison officials, who took no action even as the prisoners pleaded for rescue. Access to Cell Block 4 was delayed since emergency keys were unavailable, and authorities chose to prioritize hostage safety over intervening. With the grill finally cut open, an execution squad entered the cell block, burning the security panel, necessitating blowtorched entry into individual cells. The violence escalated as prisoners were brutally attacked. By 10 a.m., 12 inmates labeled as snitches had been slain. In total, 16 prisoners lost their lives in Cell Block 4, with atrocities recorded in gruesome detail: blowtorches, hangings, and disfigurement. The violence was unruly, with men being attacked using tools, pipes, and makeshift shanks. One victim was partially decapitated by a noose from a balcony, and his body was subsequently mutilated. The rioters set fires in various parts, including a gymnasium where bodies were incinerated. By mid-afternoon on Sunday, 36 hours after the riot began, state police and Santa Fe police officers entered the prison, which was left in ruins. Official reports indicate that at least 33 inmates died. Notably, 12 of the deceased were from the protective custody unit, and over 200 inmates sustained injuries requiring treatment. A citizens' panel investigated the incident. The panel concluded that a small group of inmates initiated the riot while most were attempting to escape it. The findings were based on extensive interviews with those involved. It took several days after the surrender to restore enough order for the inmates to safely return to the facility. The official death toll from the incident at the Penitentiary of New Mexico included 33 people. The actual death toll might have been higher because some bodies were incinerated or dismembered during the chaos. Several inmates also died of drug overdoses after raiding the prison pharmacy. After the riot, some inmates were prosecuted, but most crimes went unpunished. Despite attempts at reform, the administration resisted changes before and after the riots, but reforms eventually followed, leading to the implementation of the Bureau classification system and the development of New Mexico's modern correctional system.